Hey, welcome back guys. Good to have you here. Previous project was fun, right? We created a simple calculator application using just HTML and JavaScript. However, in this project, we are going to dive a bit deeper into JavaScript. So before we do that, let's look at the session outline. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to recap the previous project and understand how this project is different from the previous project. The next thing we're going to understand is how to use JavaScript to manipulate the DOM. We're going to get quite a bit of information from the user. We're going to ask user to input some information, and we're going to take this information and show it on our application. So we have to understand how to manipulate the DOM into getting this information that the user just entered and showing it on the application. So that means updating the DOM using this information. So we'll be covering both of these in a short while. So let's begin. So recap. So what did we do in the previous session? So we created a simple calculator application. We had a HTML file that had all the code in it, right? We wrote the JavaScript into the script tag itself. But in this application, what we are going to do is we are going to separate out the JavaScript into its own file. The reason we do this is it becomes manageable if we were to build a more complex and more wide application. So it is easier to separate out the functionality of the application and the aesthetics of the application. So aesthetics and the templating will be handled by the HTML and CSS, but the functionality is handled by the JavaScript. So it is always best if we keep them separate. So let's look at what kind of project we're going to build. So we're going to create a simple to-do application for this project. Let's first look at the scope of the project. So we're going to create a simple HTML application that takes the user inputted to-dos and displays them in a list format. So the page that I'm envisioning right now is we will have a single user input box where the user can add his or her tasks and have a button that says add. When the user clicks on this button, the information that you added in the input box has to be added on to the list. So let's see how we can develop this. Before we begin, we need to know if we have Visual Studio Code or Sublime Text or any sort of code editor installed on our computer, as well as Google Chrome. I already have installed on this computer, so I will not be doing this, but if you don't, please go ahead and install these tools. And as always, the source files are available on my GitHub page, so you can download the source code and review it. All right, so let's first look at how we can manipulate the DOM. So before we jump into the slides, let's actually start coding directly. All right, I'm going to start by creating a new folder inside my projects folder. I'm going to name this folder as to do. I'm going to open up this folder in Visual Studio Code Editor and create two files. One file to write all of the HTML and one file to write all of my JavaScript. So in the index.html file, we'll add the basic boilerplate code like we did in the last session. I'll add the bootstrap CDN to get started. I'll just copy this here, add it just above the title. And I will change the title to application. Inside the body element, we'll create two HTML elements required for this project. One is the input element and one is the button. But before I do that, let me create a master div inside which I will add the header tag and write the name of our application. Now we'll go ahead and create these two elements that are required for this application. So first one is the input, and the second one is the button. Okay, let me remove this extra space right here. Now for the button, I will give this an ID of task. I will add this of type text, and I will also add a placeholder of add task. I'll make sure I close this. Inside the button element, I'll add the ID of add. I'll add the type of button, and the label for the button I will say is add task. So this is enough for now, but we will definitely need to include the bootstrap classes that I have added. So let me go ahead quickly and add these bootstrap classes. Alright, I'll start by adding the bootstrap classes right here. Even for the input element, I'll add the class of form control. For the button, I'll add a class of button and button outline secondary. Alright, so what I want to do is I want to add this button into a different div so that I can make sure that the input element is adjacent to the button element. So I'll add a class of input group append, and right after this div, I will add a horizontal line and create another div to display the to-dos. I'll add a class of container and give it an ID of to-dos. Let's go ahead and check this application real quick. I'll open up with the live server. And so this is how the application looks, which is fine. Let us go back and add the JavaScript for this application. So before I do that, I have to add the script tag right here, just before I close the body element. Give it a source of to-do.js. Okay, now let me go back into the to-do.js and start coding. Alright, inside of here, first of all, let's walk through the steps we need to take to build this application. So I'll just write these steps down. So first is to get the to-dos from user. Okay. Second is to store these to-dos in local storage. The third would be to retrieve the to-dos from the local storage. Fourth would be to display the to-dos on application. Okay, and the last one is we want the user to delete the completed to-dos. So delete the completed to-dos. Right, excellent. Let me just comment this out so we know what we are working on. Now let's begin writing the code for getting the to-dos from the user and storing them in local storage. To accomplish this, let's write a function to add the tasks that the user needs to complete inside our local storage. So I'll start by creating this function. And for this, we'll have to get the task from the user. We do this by accessing the value that the user adds in the input element of our application page. So the input element is right here. we get its value by accessing this element by its ID using the document.getElementById. by ID. So let me go ahead and add this here first. So before I add this here, I have to create a variable to hold this value. So let me create a variable called task, and I will say document.getElementById. The name of the ID was task, and I'll need to access its value. Alright, so now the user will have multiple tasks, so it's best if you use array to store these multiple tasks. So we'll create a new array. So I'll say var to do is equal to new array, and we will add the user added task into this to do array. Do you remember how to add the elements into the array object in JavaScript? We use the push method on the array object to insert a new element into the array. So in this case it will be deduce.push, and I will say task. Okay, next we want to store this array inside of our local storage. Now, if you remember your HTML5 fundamentals and local storage, the local storage is a web storage API object that stores data in a key value pair format. We use the setItem method on the local storage object to store this array. Now, to store this array, we need to convert it into a string first. So we will have to use json.stringify to take this JavaScript object and convert it into string. So the way we would do this is we would first write down the local storage, invoke the setItem method, add a key value. So the key I'm assigning this is to do, and after this I'm going to be storing this array in a string format. So I'll say json.stringify and to-dos. Alright, now let's run this function when the user submits their task on our application, for which we will need to attach a add event listener function on the button element. So we have the button element right here, and listen to the click event. Once we record the click event, we need to run this add function. So let me go ahead and add this right outside this function. So I'll say document.getElementById, and I'll say add, and I'll attach a event listener. Now listen for the event of click. Once we listen to the event of click, we want to run the add function. So I'll say add. Alright, so now let's test this application thus far and see if we can add user inputted tasks in local storage. So I'm in my browser. I will open up the developer tools, and I will head off into the application and select the local storage. You can just ignore this. This is something I was testing before. I'll just clear this. Let's start by adding a new task. Alright, so the task 1 is being added in here with the key of to do and the value of task, that is an array. Let's add a few more tasks. Alright, so when we add tasks, the task 1 gets deleted and the task 2 is added. So we will have to make some changes to the existing code to fix this. So what we need to do is to declare a new array for storing the to-dos only if the to-dos array exists in our local storage. If the to-do array exists, then we need to retrieve and add new tasks to it. Now the way we can retrieve is to write a new function that will retrieve an existing to-dos array. So let me go ahead and create this function. I'll call this function as get to-dos. You'll see why we separated this out in a different function, as we will need to retrieve stored to-dos multiple times. All right, so inside of here, we will create a new array. I'm just going to use this line over here and move it inside. Okay, we also need to create a variable to store the existing to-dos from the local storage. So I'll create a variable existing to-dos. So I'll create a variable existing to-dos to store the existing to-dos from local storage. In this case, we'll use the getItem method on the local storage object and access the existing to-dos by referencing the key, which in our case is to-do. So if you remember, this is the key that we used. Okay, so let's write this out. So we'll say local storage dot getItem, and the key we're looking for is to-do. All right, now we need to check if the existing to-dos variable we just created is null or not, because if the to-dos don't exist in local storage, this right here will return null, which means we have to use the newly created array, which is this one right here, to store the user to-dos. Okay, but if the existing to-dos is not null, that means the to-dos exist in local storage and we assign them to this variable. Okay, so let's go ahead and write this if statement to check this condition. I'll say if existing to-dos not equal to null, then do something. Now in here, now remember we stored the to-dos array in a string format, but if we have to add new tasks to this array of to-dos, we need to convert it back into a JavaScript object. To do this, we'll use the JSON parse and assign this to-dos variable, assign this to the to-dos variable that we created earlier. So we'll assign it to this. Okay, so let's say to-dos equal to JSON.parse, and I'll say existing to-dos. And after this, we will just return existing to-dos. Now remember, this function will only return one value for to-dos. Either it will return a blank array, or it will return existing to-dos in local storage if they exist. Now let's test this application if this runs. Looks like the server is already running. So let me go back in here. We already have task 2. Let's add task 1. Okay, I'm getting an error right here. It says to-dos.push is not a function because I missed something. Okay, yes. So if you remember this, I moved this from the add function right here. So what I will do is I'll create a variable of to-dos and get these to-dos from this function right here. So it will either be existing to-dos or a blank array. So I'll say get to-dos. I'll save it. I'll go back. You can ignore this error. This is a jQuery error. I'm not really concerned about this. So I'll just add the task 1 again. Okay, I got one more error. It says to-dos.push not function. It says on line 13. Or to-dos equal to get to-dos. Okay, so this should run. What's wrong with here? Let's do a little debugging. Okay, I found the error right here. We need to return the to-dos, not the existing to-dos. Let's go back and check this once again. So the task 1 gets added. Let's add a few more tasks. Alright, so this looks good. Now let's add the code to show the to-dos we have stored in our local storage right here. So if we go back, we close this up so I can get some space. Now we'll start by creating a new function called show. So I'll create a new function called show. Now first we need to get the existing to-dos from the local storage. This is where this get to-dos function which you wrote will prove useful. So let me get the existing to-dos first. So I'll say var to-dos equal to get to-dos. We need to display these to-dos in our application. How will we do this on our application page? If you remember, we created a div in the HTML file specifically to display these to-dos. We will have to attach an HTML element to this div. We will need to access it using JavaScript and add to its inner HTML property. Now let's write the code to do so. So let me go back and add this code right here. I'll say document.getElementById. The ID for that div right here was to-dos. So I'll say to-dos dot inner HTML. Now here, what kind of HTML element you want to display these to-dos in? I believe a list format can be useful, so I'm going to create an unordered list for each to-do item, one line at a time. The inner HTML takes a string, so we'll have to compose a string first. So I'll leave this blank for now, and we will work on composing the string that we will then assign it here. So I'll start by creating a variable called HTML and assign a unordered list tag to it. So I'll say unordered list. Okay, now I need to add a list tag on each line for each to-do that is stored in an array. In order to do this, we need to loop over the array and get each individual values which can be attached to the list tag. So the way we do this is by running the for loop on the to-dos. So I'll say var I equal to 0, I less than to-dos dot length I plus plus, and inside here I will just concatenate the list item for with the unordered list element right here. So I'll just say HTML plus equal to, and I will say list div paragraph plus to-dos I, close the paragraph and the div and the list element. Alright, here each element from the array will be added inside the paragraph tag right here. Now let's finish up the HTML string by adding the closing bracket for the unordered list. So right after this I will say HTML plus equal to, and I will close the unordered list. Now we attach this HTML string that we have just composed to the inner HTML property of the div element that we accessed earlier. So it was this, and we will assign this right here. Alright, so now the show function is complete for now. Let's call this function at the end of our file. So I'll say show here, and also we need to call this inside the add function. So let me go back into the add function, call it again right here. The reason we do this is because we want the DOM to be updated when a new task is added by the user. So we'll actually call the show function right here again. So now let's test this out and see if the to-do stored inside the local storage in our application page are displayed on the application page. I'm sorry. So looks like the server is already running. Let me go back, and here it is. Okay, so we were successful in displaying the existing to-dos onto the application page. The next thing we have to do is give the user the ability to delete any completed to-dos, for which we will need a delete button for each of the to-do that is being displayed. Let's add the delete button to each of the to-do that we display. I will add a few more div and utilize the bootstrap classes to make sure I have the delete button right next to each to do. So let me add this real quickly and you will visit the code. So I will add the code right here. Alright, so I added the code right here. Now if you notice this, I added a class of remove to this button element right here. So I created a button element and added a few classes in here, and remove is one of the class that I assigned it. Now I also assigned the ID attribute to the value of I, which means now we can identify which delete button is associated with which to do in the array. Now the reason I added the class of remove is so that I can access the delete buttons with however many tasks exist in an array, and I can attach event listener for each one of them. You will see now why this is a better approach. So let's first look at how these delete buttons look. So yeah, so the delete buttons that I just added right now work. I mean, they're displayed, but they don't work actually. So we have to write the code to attach event listener for each one of them. Okay, so let us go back and attach it to them. So the first thing we need to do is we need to get all of these buttons in one go. So go ahead and right here, let me define a new variable to store all the button elements in the application. So I'll just create a variable called buttons, and I will use the document.getElement by class name, since I used the class of remove right here, and do this. Okay, so I got all the buttons. Now I need to loop over all of these buttons one by one and attach an event listener. So let me go ahead and add that real quick. 0 I less than length I plus plus, and inside for each button I'll add a event listener. The event that we're listening for is the click, and I'll add a remove function. Now we haven't returned the remove function, but we need to write this function right now and run it every time the user clicks. Okay, so let us write this function real quick outside of the show function. So I'll just create a new function called remove. Okay, so now the first thing I need is the ID of the button that has been clicked, which will give me the element inside the array to be deleted. Now, if you remember, we had already added an ID. So the way we can access this is by using the following code. Let me first write up the code and let me explain it later. So I'll say var ID equal to this dot get attribute of ID. Okay. Now, do you remember this keyword which we learned in session 2? This keyword refers to the current object in a method or a constructor. By using the get attribute, we get the ID attribute for each and every specific element, right? So if I click on this button right here, I will get the ID of 0 because that's the 0th position inside of this array. Okay, so now let me get the existing to-dos first. Let's say get to-dos. Now we delete the element from the array using ID, which is the position at which the to-do is stored, right? So I'll say to-dos dot splice. So this is a method on the array object. After we do this, we need to add this updated array into the local storage again, for which we will use the setItem method again. So I'll use local storage dot setItem, use the key, and again stored in a string format. I will say to-dos. Now this is completed. Okay, now we need to call the show function again inside this remove function because the to-dos in the array are being updated. That means the DOM needs to be updated as well. So I'll just say show again. Alright, so this looks good. Let's go ahead and test this out. So deleting task 2 did not work. Let me go into the console and see why. It says button is not defined. It shows on line 49. So let me expand this real quick. Okay, I missed the button, the yes here. We go back, delete task 1. Okay, so task 2, sorry, task 2 was deleted successfully. Now if you look at the array, I can delete the task. I can also add the task, so let's add task 2 again. We add task 3, task 4, and let me add task n. Now let's say if I wanted to delete task 3, the task 3 is deleted from the DOM as well as it's deleted from the array that is stored inside the local storage as well. Looks like everything worked as expected. That's excellent. Let's move back to the slides. So we covered everything from this slide onwards. So we covered manipulating the DOM. We also covered updating the DOM in real time when we use the show method. So I think we are good to go. We have completed all of these successfully. Here are some additional resources for you to improve on this to-do list. In the next session, we'll be covering project 3, for which we will develop a to-read book list. You'll see why this project is different from this one, although we are building the list again. So I'll see you in the next session. Thank you for learning with me. Take care. Bye-bye.